So I'll make a brief comment that right now we are starting into our breakout. So please take a look at the program and figure out where you would like to be. We obviously are going to have another session in just a moment. But here at the Global Sport Institute, we are a traditional research institute. So we conduct our own research. We also fund research, which if you were here yesterday, you got to see a glimpse of some of the research that we are funding. But we also curate research. And so what we know is that we can't do all of the research. We wouldn't be good at everything. And so part of my responsibility is to go out and look for what's the next research and who is doing that research. So over the course of this year, I traveled to a few different conferences and events, and we found and identified 3 emerging scholars who I want to invite up. Throughout the day, you're going to see videos of us getting a sense of what work they're doing and how they're contributing to the field of race and sports. So I'll invite up Tori Alexis Thompson, Natalie Welch, and Javier Wallace, and then we'll take a look at the video.
I am Natalie Welch. I am originally from the Cherokee Indian Reservation in Cherokee, North Carolina. I am a graduate teaching associate at the University of Tennessee, currently working on my doctorate studies in sport management. I really came back to get my PhD because I wanted to study Native American athletes in sport. My dissertation is focusing on this phenomenon of Native American athletes giving back to their community and how they have this great platform as athletes and they really cherish that role. Ultimately, I'm a storyteller, and that's what I wanted to do in my work. And it really clicked in my mind that I wanted to do a documentary as a part of my dissertation. So instead of writing up 20 pages of findings from interviews, I would actually be, taking video, audio, sound clips, and producing a documentary. But it's been really fun to kind of break the mold of a typical dissertation and kind of break some of those Western ideals of what research has to look like. So that's inherent in kind of who I am as an Indigenous researcher.
Okay, so this is the panel that I mentioned that would lead us off and maybe turn us from Bill's uplifting direction. That we have had some success over the past few years. And I'm going to do a real quick introduction of all the panelists. So they'll kind of stay seated until I bring them up. So let me start off with the moderator, Marcus Scott. She's an associate general counsel right here with the Arizona Diamondbacks and president of WISE Arizona, the Women in Sports and Events. She's also a faculty associate here at Arizona State University, where she teaches ethics and legal studies in sports. Also on the panel is, make sure this slide comes over to the right person, I don't do a false introduction, Lori Okamura. She's the chair of the board of USA Volleyball. For those of you that aren't into the Olympic world, this is the enterprise that fields the Olympic volleyball teams, beach, indoor, and sitting, and in global competitions as well. She is the first Asian American woman to lead USA Volleyball and probably any NGB. So as I said, to take a close look at people getting to the top, she's been involved in a number of sports marketing positions, and also somebody had to do it. She's been in the leadership at the University of Southern California as well. Next is Troy Vincent. Troy is currently the Executive Vice President of Football Operations at the National Football League. He won't mention it, but he had a 15-year career in the NFL, largely with the Eagles, originally drafted by the Miami Dolphins. He also served as president of the NFL Players Association, so having leadership positions on both sides, and deeply engaged in a number of civic issues focused on improving the world. Next is Rene Dorado. She is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for MLB, MLB Advanced Media, and the MLB Network. She's the first female chief at Major League Baseball. She's a lawyer who has had a number of positions in and out of sport, including work with the United States Tennis Association. And finally, Jeffrey Orridge, longtime friend. His bio doesn't do justice to the many positions he's held in sports over the years, in basketball, sports apparel companies. In this context, though, and I don't know how many people are aware of the heights that we have reached. I mean, he was the commissioner of the Canadian Football League, and in many ways, the highest ranking person of color in sport in North America. So let me bring all the panelists up, and Maka will take you through the conversation.
So as Kenneth mentioned, we have a great group of panelists today, and I'm excited to hear from them on these topics of climbing the ladder and getting to the top and overcoming obstacles. Because we all know with successes, there are challenges. So we kind of going to talk through, the successes that they've had and then those challenges along the way. I want to start by talking about at least, you may not have the typical day, but some of your core responsibilities. So Lori, can you share with us some of your core responsibilities?
Sure. So for USA Volleyball, as Ken mentioned, we are the national governing body for Olympic and Paralympic beach volleyball, indoor volleyball, sitting volleyball in the Paralympics, and now, this may sound a little funny, snow volleyball and beach paravolley. I kid you not, our U.S. teams right now are competing in a snow volleyball event in Austria. They're winning. It's a real thing, I promise you. But for me, the position with USA Volleyball is actually, some people are surprised to find out, voluntary. The board of directors is a volunteer body to the organization, but I think that in the position that I have been fortunate enough to be in, you have to really treat it like it's your job. You have to be responsible and accountable. So for me, there's a good portion of my day, probably almost half of my day, about 4 or 5 hours in the morning, is spent on volleyball topics and issues. I also happen to work in the space of volleyball, so there's a theme here. And my interaction is mostly with the consumer marketplace. So for a day for me is split. It's not a traditional 9 to 5. I was joking earlier that because I deal a lot with international sport, through sporting goods manufacturing and such, that there will be times that I have to take a call and it's, pretty early in the morning my time, and they keep, putting, Miss Okimura, why is your video not enabled? Well, because I'm in my pajamas and it's 12 a.m. My video will not be enabled for this call. So my day is an odd collection of hours, but it's not unlike anybody else's day. You get things done in the time you need to get it done, and there it is.
And over to Jeff, the Canadian-American, or American-Canadian. Which one comes first?
Well, you know what? I think I'm in a unique position because being an American and Canadian, I can be both arrogant and apologetic at the same time. But no, I'm an American by birth, and some would argue a Canadian by choice. I think one of the things that I most appreciate now about where I am, being a consultant and having my own company in the last couple of months, is that I can be open to everything and attached to nothing, right? So I'm doing the same thing similarly that I was doing as commissioner of the CFL or running global sports marketing for Reebok or any number of jobs, being able to look into and assist in problem solving for whatever client I have. So even when I was in-house working for an organization, I still had clients, and there were challenges every day that you just have to find solutions for.
Understood. Rene, typical day or core responsibilities if you can't find that typical day.
Well, I'm not as interesting as you, right? Because I'm just from Brooklyn. Sorry. There's always one, so you got to work it. And I'm Latina, so that could add a whole other layer of baggage, but we won't go into that. My typical day, so as mentioned, I'm the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the 3 entities with Major League Baseball, but I also serve to support the 30 clubs that we have with their diversity and inclusion agenda. A typical day is not typical. We have a ton of programming at any given time that we're running and managing, making sure the wheels stay on the bus. But we also are responsible for the supplier diversity program at Major League Baseball. We've been doing this for over 20 years to a tune of $2 billion in investment that continues to grow. And I manage the staff. I am not a party of one. Everyone sees me, but I have a team, a great team back home that supports the agenda as well. And we focus on talent, community engagement, positioning the brand of MLB as a sport and entertainment of choice for all people, no matter what they look like. So it's ongoing. So you do have the emails, you have the conversations, a lot of relationship building, a lot of making sure that we're delivering on the promises, but also managing the metrics of what we do. We can institute programs ad nauseum, but if there's nothing to show at the end of the day around this, it doesn't make sense. So a lot of our day is also like, how are we doing? And where do we have to tweak and improve upon? So it always changes, but it's always a lot of fun.
That's great. Yes, Troy, we're down to you.
I'm very similar to Rene. I'll just start with core responsibilities is I have an opportunity to work with the player that's past, present, and future. The game, which is everything that is associated with the game. Officiating. Yeah, we just passed a replay proposal. Thank God. And then there's club services, club support. So I don't have my typical day is logging around that 75-pound book bag with documents, 3-ring binder, computer, because my conversation can go from talking to a prospect's parents about the invite to the NFL draft, to diversity and inclusion topics, to what are we going to do in China, playing a game in China, to what's our next social responsibility activation, to just, okay, who's the next hire? From a coach to football personnel, working on a ton of different initiatives. So my day, though I try to have structure around it, depending on who's on the other end of the phone, it's a conversation, it is relationship management, it's making sure everyone feels like their opinion matters. There's an inclusive process in everything that we do. So that's my typical day.
Okay, so what I've heard is no typical day.
No typical day.
And thank you for joining us and sticking around after the league meetings. So Jeff, I'm going to bounce around a little bit. Please tell me about some of the leadership principles you kind of live by that you think have contributed to your success.
I think all of us would say that none of us got to wherever we are by virtue of ourselves, right? We've all had support. We've had mentors. My first mentors were my parents. So I've got to say that I probably had a head start because they focused on education and they emphasized excellence. So I think it was that foundation and that background that basically had me focus on IQ, EQ, and what I call AQ, right? So we know about, IQ, learning as much as you can about not just the subject matter that you're interested in, but also learning about yourself and what suits you. I think the emotional quotient that you bring to the table, understanding other people, and having a and empathy, serving first, like that whole servant leadership concept, has held me in good stead. And then I think finally, it's about AQ, which is about adjustment and adaptation, because particularly being a person of color, and being the first general counsel at USA Basketball and the first commissioner of the CFL, and there was no template. And so you have to, there are different standards, there are different perceptions, there are different indicators of success for you as opposed to your white male counterparts. And so you have to constantly adjust and take course correction, and kind of figure it out. And so I think the adaptability is just as important as the intelligence and the emotional quotient.
Okay, so we all need to work on our AQ.
AQ is key.
So Lori, same question for you. What are some of those leadership principles that you live by that has helped you in your success?
I think with everything that Jeffrey touched on, I would also add communication. You know, that so I was early on in my career headed down a journalism, sports media path, right? And so learning how to communicate your message, I think, is as important as the message itself, right? To get people to listen to what you have to say and absorb it and understand it. I think in terms of leadership, you have to also have a conversation about loyalty. You know, loyalty to a cause, loyalty to your company, loyalty to your brand, and then I think it's also part of the discussion should also be being proactive. You know, where are there opportunities? I always say to, you know, whether it's student athletes or business students that I'm lucky enough to interact with, is you have to make an opportunity for yourself before you can help make an opportunity for someone else. Right. And part of creating that opportunity is, you know, learning as much as you can about the subject matter that you're going to be, you know, in charge of or, you know, be part of the discussion of. But then again, I always go back to communicating that. You can lead people, but if they don't understand what you're saying, or if they don't, you know, resonate, your message doesn't resonate with them because you haven't communicated it properly, then it's really not as effective, you know, at all, right? So to me, I would add communication to that.
Absolutely agree. Renee, do you have some leadership principles that you kind of live by that kind of helped you in your success and your growth?
Over-deliver every time, every single time. You can't waver on that. Listen more than you speak. That's always been pretty helpful for me because you kind of learn everything you need to know and about the room and the people you're working with if you spend a little bit more time listening. And probably, lastly, never assume you're the smartest person in the room, and keep yourself open to continuing to learn and expand your skill set. There's never really a pinnacle. There's always more to do and more to attain. So if you look at it that way and you keep yourself open to learning, I think you'll actually be on the right track.
Other great principles. Troy, what are some?
I would build on what Renee's, just being a great listener. For myself personally, I mean, I think for the athletes and those that are beyond, you know, just being okay with who you are. My leadership comes from my walk with my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and the things that myself and my wife, we value. So that allows me to be comfortable with who I am, where I'm at, and what's going on. Doesn't matter the situation or the topic. It allows me to always come back to a base of, okay, what's being reasonable at all times. Renee mentioned being a great listener and being reasonable. And sometimes in our environment, sometimes you just have to listen so that you can actually hear what the other person is saying, whether you agree or disagree, and not giving body language that you disagree or that you agree with, or there's an assumption that you don't like what you're hearing. But I would just say, from a leadership principle standpoint, just value. What do you value, and staying true to your core values?
That was all really great information. Lori, I'm back to you. I know you have an extensive career in volleyball. I want to know kind of how you got your start.
Right. So for me, and I love this question because it comes down to participation. right? So I grew up in Hawaii. Volleyball is the national pastime. And by the way, I still get the question, is Hawaii still part of the United States? And the answer is yes. We have statehood and everything. But for me, it was participating in sport. And I got started at a really young age in volleyball through my grandmother, right, who played until she was 88 years old with a bunch of lady friends. And it was their way to stay connected, right? And for me, that sort of turned out to be the same, it's my way to be connected. I, like most kids, I want to be a volleyball player in college. I want to be a professional athlete. Maybe when you start and you enjoy the sport and you get really into it. But my path took a definite turn in that I was physically unable, through injury to continue at a certain point. And then you have to ask yourself the question, can you find another way to contribute? Right? Can you find another way to be a part of this, that has consumed your life for all these years? And are there other opportunities that you might be able to make for yourself that you can continue to give back? And it just happened that for me, it's always been in the world of volleyball. I think this opportunity with USA Volleyball to be at the top of our sport is pretty much the end of the cycle for me. I've been in every job that there is to have in volleyball. Coach, player, I made volleyballs, the actual ball. Worked in the sporting goods industry for a long time, ended up in the international side of things. So by being flexible and being willing to try just about any job that there was, it led me to a really good place as far as one particular industry. Whatever industry that is, to be able to see one industry from multiple perspectives, to me has been one of the most valuable experiences. And it all started for me just by playing, just by participating. Right.
Thank you for that, Lori. So I want to get into some of the challenges you guys have faced on the way to getting to where you are. And I want to take a couple of questions from the audience, a couple of tough questions I see. Jeff, I'm going to propose this one to you. When will there be a commissioner of color in MLB, NFL, or the NBA?
Well, it took until 2015 for there to be a commissioner of color in any professional sports league, right? And that was Canada. And Canada has always boasted that they've been progressive in sport for the longest. They had the first professional black quarterback. They had the first professional black football player. So they've always boasted that. So it in theory made sense that they would have the first black commissioner. One of the challenges that we have, though, is not being the first, but who comes after you. You want to make sure that there is a second and a third. I have no idea. I mean, I think part of the challenge is that there is a structure in place, and many commissioners are kind of homegrown. Adam Silver and I both came into the NBA in 1991, and he was immediately groomed as the successor to David Stern. So he's been in the league for a long time. He has that knowledge and experience and understanding. Commissioner Goodell was with the NFL for quite some time before that. So I mean, when you look at these leagues, a lot of them are homegrown, and unless you have people who are hired at the inception to learn the industry and to make the connections and to navigate the politics, it can be very difficult to break in.
I think that day's coming. I think it's sooner than what we may believe, and I think that's our role and our responsibility as leaders today, is to identify and prepare that next individual to take on that mantle. But I do see that day is near. It's not as far away as we think it may be, but I think that is truly our role and responsibility, is to identify those individuals and assist them in their or her development and taking on that role.
Yeah, I can't answer when, but I agree with Troy. I think it'll be sooner than we think. I think part of it is making sure people like yourself and the people up here, the people up here right now are creating a culture in sports where it's not going to be so shocking and it's not going to take so long. I think the other part of the responsibility on the existing leagues is to continue to build out programs and initiatives that will create a legitimate pipeline. That, look, there's never been a lack of talent of people of color who are prepared for these roles. That's never been the issue. What has been the issue are navigating the politics, building out the relationships internally, and making sure that the culture and the climate of the sports and the leagues actually set up a system of success for new ideas and new people to come into leadership. And I think as long as the leagues are committing to creating that, and I know I can speak on baseball's behalf, I believe we're well on our way in that direction. I think there will be an opportunity, and we will see it sooner than later. And I'd like to add, maybe it would be a woman. So.
Renee,
if I can just pick up on something Renee said and Troy, I think the sentiment is there. I think the structure now has to be there, and I think it goes to what they're saying about creating an environment that is conducive to the pipeline. But it's not just internally; it is preparing the public as well, right? And I think with the inception of one person of color, one woman setting the stage, people then have a tendency to be a little more comfortable with yet another.
so with that, Renee, can you talk to us about some of the programming that MLB has in place to kind of move the needle?
Sure. In 2016, we launched the Diversity Pipeline Program specifically to diversify baseball operations and front offices on a league and club level. Through that pipeline, in the last 3 years, we've placed over 100 people of color and women in entry-level internship and full-time roles at different levels in baseball ops. The idea being that, you have to see yourself reflected in the sport, right? You have to start to expose the sport to different types of talent and what that looks like, and have a legitimate investment in that. The 2.0 of that has been the fellowship program, which we launched in 2017 and had our first inaugural class in 2018. The fellowship program also focused on baseball operations and front office, but it was a little bit more specific. So the pipeline program, basically we're teeing up candidates, we're cultivating candidates for the clubs to make their decision. With the fellowship program, it was a little bit of a longer program. The idea was, what I had learned after being there about 18 months was how relationship driven this industry is, and how more often than not, a lot of women and people of color did not have access to building those relationships, and that doesn't always happen in a 3-month internship program. You need more time. So the fellowship program created basically a rotational program in baseball operations in the front office, anywhere from 18 months to 2 years on the club side and 3 years at the office of the commissioner. And last year we placed 22 candidates in those roles across 16 teams, and then we had the office of the commissioner has a few there as well, and half of that class, it's all women, it's all people of color, and half are women. So the idea was to allow them a much more structured program to learn the baseball operations, and hopefully this would be the pool of candidates that will be a future AGM or GM or head of scouting, and ultimately a commissioner of baseball. But it was also equally important to give people time to cultivate their network. So ideally, these candidates will convert into full-time roles at the conclusion of the fellowship program, but if not, they will now be a part of an internal LinkedIn program that we call MLB Select, and we will be able to tee them up as candidates for other clubs when other opportunities arise. On the gender side, one of the things we've done in 2017, we started the Katie Feeney Leadership Symposium. So those of you, especially the ladies in here who don't know Katie Feeney, she had a 50-year career in baseball. Started out as an admin and went all the way up and was responsible for all the scheduling, had an incredible career, and unfortunately in 2017 she passed away very abruptly, and we named this leadership symposium in her honor in partnership with Stanford University Executive Education Program. The idea being that we had not really invested in a learning and development program for our existing female employees in baseball. So every year at the winter meetings now, we bring in a new class of approximately 50 women from all of our clubs.
Last year's class.
Yes, you were. You're an alum now. Did you like it?
It was great. It was a great symposium, great
talk it up.
program. No, I mean, it really is. And it gives us an opportunity to all sit in the room and kind of discuss the same things and grow and develop. And you need that network, and you need that closed session to really develop that network.
Yeah, and it was beyond the work-life balance conversations, right? This was about
absolutely.
leadership competencies, managing teams, et cetera. So we have a great, huge investment in that, and have gotten a lot of support from the commissioner on down, and that will continue to grow. We rotate the classes every year. The first year were SVPs and above. This year with director levels, and we'll continue to drill this down. So hopefully all the women in baseball at some point will get access to this program. In 2018, we launched the Take the Field program at winter meetings, which also focused on how do we place more women on the field roles, especially in scouting, umpiring, et cetera. It was a one-day program where the faculty for that program were actually club personnel. We had 60 women from around the country who flew themselves in, USA Baseball, USA Softball, college students, and existing MLB employees who were looking to grow their career. And I'm happy to say out of that pool, approximately 8 to 10 women actually got jobs on the spot that weekend. So again, it kind of goes to, if you continue to provide these opportunities to expose this talent in a new way, you give aha moments to the people that are making those decisions, and they will start to bring in people, and they will start to become aspirational models for future leadership.
Yeah, you guys are putting on you have created some great initiatives and programs and expanded. I'm really excited about the things that MLB has put in place. Troy.
This is work in progress for us.
Yeah.
Well, we've done some great things on we would say, the non-revenue side of the house.
Okay.
And I just think as we think about, in particular, the students, we have to be intentional about positions, whether it's on the legal side, finance, international, the for-profit side of the house. You look at today, we have no people of color at the president's level. You start looking at the heads of marketing. So we have to look at the entire universe. The focus has always been on what we see as fans. That's the coach, that's the general manager, that's the player participation. But we really have to focus on those positions that you don't see publicly, that you typically are not getting quotes from, and be very intentional about the efforts to identify and expose those men and women for those positions on, as we would say, the for-profit side of the house. But we have work to do here in this particular area.
And what efforts are you taking to kind of open the door for others?
Well, we have programs very similar to the MLB, from coaching, front office, again, focus on the football side of the house. So we have some very strong programs working with the 32 clubs and identifying whether it's young student athletes or those that are outside of the college ranks for many different positions on the football side of the house. That's gender, that is training room, that is strength coaches. We have some very comprehensive programs in that arena. Where we really need work on is that president, the operation side, on the side of the house where the revenues generated, the partnerships are generated. We have some work there, and the commissioner has committed. We talked about that this previous week at the owners meeting, that we have to make intentional efforts, and the clubs have to be all part of making sure that we address what everybody wants, and that's full inclusion.
And I think as long as you're having those conversations, you're headed in the right direction, right? So maybe you don't have all the programs in place yet on the operations side, but as long as you recognize that there's an issue, that there's something we should be doing, then you're headed in the right direction.
So I'm going to respectfully disagree with that.
Okay.
I think because we've been having these conversations for decades. I think there's now a point, and I
So
think
how do
we're
you think
all
we
here.
move the needle?
I think we're all here now, right? Like you start hiring people to kind of implement programs. You have internal champions of these type of agendas that are bringing these topics to the table. But until we start to formalize these conversations or actually put some actual substance to the conversations, I think we're just going to be here again in 10, 15 years waiting for the first GM or, head of, NFL based president of ops, being someone that's not of a certain demographic every single time. So I think it's great. I'm not discounting that, but we have to ramp up on this because this is getting a little exhausting. Yeah,
Well, you get past the not just the conversation. The programs are one thing, but we gotta address. It's the networking. All of these things matter when it comes into people hiring. You hire who you're comfortable with.
Right, it's the biases.
Yes,
it's managing the biases, but it's also creating a culture that's ready for that person. You know, so it's not. You're right. You're absolutely right. It's not just creating the programs, because we have the talent. That's not the issue. It's how do we also, at the same time, it's a sandwich approach. How are we going to create a culture that allows this talent to thrive fairly, equitably? Forget fairly, just equitably. You know, because that's the thing. So again, conversations are great. We've been hearing these conversations for years, and now what? What are we going to do substantively?
That kind of brings us to, Lori, you have mentioned an obstacle you've gone through, you know, kind of making your way up, and I would like for you to share one of the many stories that you have. And challenges and kind of related to what Renee's saying about making sure first you have a culture. So after you get these programs in place and put these people inside of these organizations, that you create a culture where they can thrive and that they want to be in. So just give us an example of, you know, some
Right.
bad culture.
So yeah, so the culture point cannot be underscored enough. I mean, it is, to Renee's point, it is the onboarding process, right, can be as important as getting a point to the conversation where, okay, now we're going to give me a name, right? Give me a name, and now we're going to start, you know, putting some action behind it. So, you know, I think one of the greatest obstacles when I came toward the end of, you know, most recently in my career, and when I became the president of USA Volleyball, the chairman of the board, there was an interesting moment. You know, so at first it wasn't necessarily something I planned to highlight, that I was the first Asian American to hold this type of a position, right? In our sport of volleyball, you know, Japan in particular plays a pretty big role in the origins, you know, of our sport. And so from that standpoint, you could look at it and that's a benefit, that somebody who is Japanese, you know, I'm also a little bit Hawaiian and I come from, you know, the United States, right? But all those things put together in our sport could seem somewhat attractive, or at least a positive. The first words, and this was just ironically, this was just down the street where we had our big annual meeting, and becoming, you know, being a part of this organization and being in this position was not something that I aspired to. It wasn't something that was in my career path, right? It came about somewhat accidentally, in fact, you know, to be honest. And just down the street 5 years ago, the moment after I was elected to be in this position, one of my predecessors walked up to me. He'd been, you know, somewhat the godfather of our world, and said immediately, in a joking fashion, but still, you know, quite seriously, "Well, it looks like we're going to have to change the furniture in the boardroom because now we have an Oriental chair." You know, I will tell you that my reaction to that, and we had a little bit of a discussion, you know, before the panel. You know, your reaction to things like that is as important. You know, I'm not somebody who's very high profile, and I don't, you know, people don't quote me or whatnot. But for people who are in that position, right, you have a pretty large lens, you know, on you, and a lot of eyes focused. You know, for me, knowing that person, that was part of their DNA, unfortunately, right, evoked a little bit of a more aggressive response. But unfortunately, that is not the first time that something like that has happened, and it won't be the last. You know, it wasn't the last, right? That was only 5 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday, right? In fact, I was walking through that hotel lobby just the other day, and I thought, oh my God, this is where it happened. So you can choose to be defined by that, you know, or in my case, I wasn't actually going to mention in the press release that they were putting out that that the Asian American component, you know, of this position was somewhat significant. But you better believe that I highlighted that shortly after that comment, you know, because Oriental chair or not, give me that gavel and let me whack somebody upside the head, you know. So it's how and there are also other examples of when, you know, to the point earlier about listening, you know, and listening is very important. You can read the room, you know, understand what the temperature is in the room that you're about to walk into. There have been a lot of obstacles, my career in particular, where I'm either the only American in the room, the only woman, the only Asian woman, the only person who speaks English or whatnot, and that could be pretty isolating, in your path, right? And so you just, I think for me, the way to overcome that has been, again, the communication part of it. There's verbal communication. There's also physical communication, your body language. If you walk in and you act like you don't belong, then you better believe you're not going to be accepted, right? If you walk in and you're confident but not arrogant, you probably stand a better chance of being able to open up a dialogue. The communication part is huge. But really, and what I appreciate so much, we've all just met today, but what I've appreciated so much about the career paths of everybody up here is that they're very authentic. You have to be authentic. Don't pretend to be something that you're not, right? Don't try to fit yourself into an image or a stereotype. Everybody, in my world, I worked for a sporting goods company that was Japanese. And whenever we did meetings in the United States, outside of the Japanese, employees and such, they automatically assumed I was either the woman who was serving the tea, I was the translator, or I couldn't possibly be the person that they were going to be conducting business with, right? Don't put yourself in that stereotype. They assumed if I'm Japanese, I'm the finance person. I'm terrible at math. I will say that up front, but don't lower yourself, to an image that you think you are supposed to portray, right? Don't lock yourself in that box that people will try to put you in. And your reaction to some of these things, which we talked a little bit about, would be on a case-by-case basis. You really do have to take the temperature of the room that you're in before you can decide how to approach it. When we're talking about race or gender or socioeconomic, any
Absolutely
component,
agree.
Thanks, Lori. When we talked about that earlier, the first thing that came to my mind was we all have that moment. We all will be faced with that moment of what are you going to do when that occurrence or that experience happens. And it's one thing about being a chair in the room or having a seat at the table. There's another thing when you're an armless chair. I want you to think about that. Because you can have a seat at the table, but if you're not willing to be intentional about your position, you actually do a disservice to your people, to your coworkers, and the folks that are behind you. If you allow some of these things to happen or experiences to happen, and you're not addressing it, I always say your silence implies that you're okay with it. And we've all had those moments, and there are ramifications if not handled properly, if they're not addressed properly. So when we were just talking about it, when you were sharing, it was because we all have them. You all will have them in your professional journey. I remember 2 years ago, in a room, public, someone made a comment about the players being inmates or that's a moment. That is a moment. And then you wait 60 more minutes and you just hear more and more and more and more. Okay, I know my grandmother and grandfather sitting here listening saying, okay, what are you going to do? Because nobody's saying anything and this mountain is building up. Because he's not the only one that's sharing this sentiment. Now, it was a moment where you say, whatever comes out of your mouth, it could be, as I mentioned, as I took the mic, and I won't share everything, but as I took the mic after that 60 or 90 minutes, I looked to my left because the commissioner was sitting right next to me, and I said, I serve one God, and he's not in this room. And this may be my last meeting, Commissioner Goodell. No, that was with this may be my last meeting. And then I proceeded to addressing the men and the women in the room that were making comments. But we all have that moment. And again, we're all going to address them differently. But I say for us not addressing those things, you do a disservice to yourself, a disservice to your colleagues that are counting on you. And we also do a disservice to the men and the women that are behind us looking for hope.
So So if I can pick up on that, that's excellent. What Troy is talking about, though, is leadership, right? And the quality of leadership. And leadership does not come without sacrifice, without jeopardy sometimes, and without courage. And I think it's the opposite of courage is sometimes not fear, but it's conformity. And if you conform to the status quo, if you allow the current to take you, even though you believe it is antithetical to who you are as a person and who you represent as a people, whether you're representing your parents or your grandparents or your friends or your colleagues or whoever that may be, that's where you have to make those choices. But you also, in all fairness and in practicality, you've got to be strategic about when you're going to make those choices. And we had that conversation. Early on in my career, I was totally disrespected as a Harvard-trained corporate lawyer closing a $300 million revolving credit facility. And I had a choice at that point to either walk out of the room or close the deal and figure out the next step. I stayed in the room and I closed the deal. But later on, I figured out the next step. But, you know, when you've got student loans piling up, you know, and other considerations, when you got a family to feed, you got to make those choices. So it does not come without potential sacrifice or risk. But that's what leadership, anytime you're a leader, people are going to shoot at you. That's the bottom line. They're going to take shots at you, and they're going to try to minimize you, no matter who you are or where you are.
Renee,
I just say really, really quickly to add to that. Oftentimes, and we talk about this in the context of, you know, as a person of color or a woman who has to deal with this conversation and having the onus put on us to confront these issues. I challenge, you know, our counterparts, Caucasian males, Caucasian women, to take it on as well. You're in the room too. It's just as much your responsibility. So, you know, as people of color, we have to get this done and we have to be a voice. We have to navigate it more carefully, more diplomatically, because the ramifications are real. But that, you know, we have other people in the room as well that have to be allies behind this conversation. Because at the end of the day, disrespect is universal. Disrespect is disrespect. Offensive is offensive. And we all have a collective responsibility, if we're all committed to making these sports that we're involved in more inclusive and more accessible, and most importantly, well, not most importantly, but profitable across the board to anyone, no matter what you look like, then the same leadership competency that we're talking about here should be imputed upon all.
and that is a great way to end our panel. We all have a responsibility. Thank you, guys. Thank you all.